Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen, and this is a very special bonus edition of the Bureau. Special amongst other things because I will be speaking a lot more. But this is when the Bureau meets Jason Woodbury of Aquarium Drunkard. Now, if you don't know it, the Los Angeles online music magazine Aquarium Drunkard is much more than a blog. It's kind of like a map to the sprawling and often overwhelming landscape of independent music. Founded in 2005 by Justin Gage, it served for over 20 years as a curator, an advocate, a welcoming community for those seeking sounds and culture beyond the mainstream. Great writing dedicated to unearthing forgotten gems and celebrating artists who operate outside the commercial pressures of the mainstream. And while the blog itself is the heart of the operation, the Aquarium Drunkard podcast transmissions, hosted by the very warm, erudite Jason Woodbury, has become a massive archive, a resource for conversations and deep dives into the worlds of music, with an amazing range of artists and figures, including Jeff Bridges, Jim Jarmusch, John Lurie, Thurston, Devendra Banhart, Bonnie Prince Billy, Shirley Collins, Gina Birch, and many more. The list goes on and on. I love it. Now, as well as for Aquarium Drunkard, Jason has written for Pitchfork, Stereo Gum. He writes lineup notes for labels like Numero and Third Man Records, Light of the Attic. He's the creative director of Wastoids. He makes radiophonic sound collages, and he's a musician. So, of course, one of the first questions I ask him is, how does he get it all done? Especially because he's got 2 dogs at home in the Sonoran Desert in Phoenix. But Jason and I decided to make a joint transmission to talk about Aquarium Drunkard and Bureau of Lost Culture and why we do it. There's a bit of mutual back scratching, but I think we get on to the much more important topics of the best time to do creative work, not eating in your 20s, smoking, dreaming, the collective unconscious, who really owns the Beatles yesterday, consciousness, the most emotional moments from our shows, the power of conversation and storytelling, who'd we really like to interview, and what's next. So, here we go. I am very pleased to be talking across the airwaves from Scotland to Phoenix, Arizona, with Jason Woodbury of Aquarium Drunkard. Jason, very nice to see you, be here with you.
Yeah, same, Stephen. I'm such a fan of your show and of the way you do things, and any admiration, I can assure you, is very, very reciprocal on my end.
Well, listen, we're going to talk a bit about each other's shows and all that sort of stuff, and anything, actually, I thought. And for listeners, obviously, this is a bit of a different thing because we're kind of interviewing each other. But listen, I've got to ask you, first of all, Jason, how do you do it all? Because it's not like you're just doing transmissions with Aquarium Drunkard, each of which is an hour minimum, show. But I mean, all the other stuff you do. I mean, you're a musician, right? But you're a writer, mainly in music, and creative director of this Wastoids project. Uh-huh. You've got another radio thing, radiophonic sound. How do you squeeze it all in?
I don't know. I sometimes wonder if I do too much. This is something that has come up recently on transmissions in my interview with the great American guitarist William Tyler. Doing my own music was a thing that was a big part of my life for a long time, and then kind of for a decade or so while I was establishing things as a writer and as a podcaster, I didn't end up spending all that much time playing music, but that did kind of come roaring back in during the pandemic, and I have not been able to shake it. So as far as how I do it all, there's just a sort of driving enthusiasm that pushes me forward and just compels me to try to get my arms around all of that. You balanced a lot yourself, right? I mean, I spent this morning listening to your latest record with The Real Tuesday Weld, Late Flowering Reveries, and really enjoyed that. So how do you balance all of it, I guess, is a good question as well. You're also a writer. You're also very busy. How do you do it, Stephen?
Well, I do feel a bit squeezed at times, actually. I try and do this thing where I give the mornings to creative work, and then all the other stuff are just taking care of business, as it were. I do in the afternoons, just because generally speaking, I'm freshest in the morning, and it is quite a lot of stuff. And I think that over time, you look back and you think, crikey, how did I do all that stuff? But, if you're doing things regularly with persistence, it starts to build up, doesn't it? I'm quite fortunate, I think, in the sense that I've been able to, by hook or by crook, make a living in the arts, mainly by doing different things. They talk about these days having multiple income streams. This is this phrase that came in, the last few years. In my case, it's multiple income dribbles.
But I relate. Yeah.
But so somehow balancing it up, and without wishing to sound too sort of woo-woo or pompous, is that I realised that my vocation, my career, such as it was going to be, is contributing to culture in a unique way. So anything that I can do, whether it be music or writing or through transmissions, as you call them, which is a great phrase, I think, for broadcasts, is part of that. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I'm in the process right now of going back and revisiting different episodes of transmissions for a potential collection of some sort of some of those interviews. That when I go back and listen, I can almost hear the preoccupations that I have at any given time, right? Sort of manifest through all of the different projects, right? Yeah. So I'll find, I seemed like I was really, kind of zoomed in on this one aspect, and I see it in the reviews or the writing from that time. I hear it in the show, and now that I've got my own artistic practice also in the mix, I hear it in that as well. I do tend to think that, one thing feeds into the other, and at some point it almost starts to just feel like it's all one thing, and I don't know if that's good or bad, but that's how it feels for me. So I do think that the multiple streams kind of converge in their own way.
Yeah, the thing which I've come up against is that it's difficult to now do anything else. As in, do more, In fact, my motto has been do less better, actually, really. Try and do a bit less, but do it better. There are things that I'd like to do more of in terms of Bureau of Lost Culture and music, actually, but there isn't any time, that's the thing. So I think if I had more resources, if the dribbles turned into gushing fountains, I could probably take on some more stuff, but for now, this is, I think, probably like you, I'm pretty full, But at the same time, I feel blessed to be able to do it.
Absolutely. And, I identify with that so much. I really hear you. I have found myself saying more and more that you have to start saying no, sometimes. You have to say no to people. You have to turn down things you want to do. I do have a sort of desire, and I don't know if it's something that's exacerbated by our internet culture, to do so many different things. You do only have so much time, and you do only have so much bandwidth. In my early 30s, and I think about how I would work all day at a job that did not allow me a lot of, space for things like the podcast or writing. It was something that took up all of my time. And I think about how I'd get home from work and I would just write, for hours after I had done my job. And at some point, I didn't quite have that same kind of thing. I'm glad you mentioned, feeling kind of more tapped in the morning. That is also the case for me. I like to wake up early, and I like to get some of that creative stuff going early in the day. And then, these days, I don't find myself able to do a whole bunch in the evening. I'm tapped out or whatever.
It's funny because a friend of mine, Glenn Duncan, who's a writer, novelist of many years. He's an old mate of mine from childhood, but we used to live together, and we used to be both in our room in this shared flat in Ladbroke Grove in London, and we used to work like all hours, and we'd sort of come out of our rooms, at sort of 2 a.m. to smoke, and sort of like, how's it going? Yeah, all right, how's it going? Now we speak to each other, and I'm like, I couldn't possibly do that anymore, There's just no way I could do these sort of mammoth 13, 14-hour sessions,
No.
Especially smoking cigarettes at the time, and just absolutely no way to get away with it.
Have you shaken that habit? Do you still smoke?
No, I haven't smoked for many, many years. I have more energy as a consequence. But in those days,
Sure.
I'm sure it was a fantasy even then, but it felt like it was the fuel, didn't eat anything, of course. I was saying to Glenn, I was like, I can't remember eating at all in my 20s. I actually love food now. In London, we're particularly blessed because we can get great food all the time, but I don't remember eating in my 20s. It just seemed like an annoying interference. It interfered with smoking for a start.
Yeah, all of the important things, sleeping, eating, resting, clearing your head. Those were things that were, for lesser, creative geniuses. Yeah, I know what you mean. The first job I got that was really in the sort of media sphere was I started working for the alt weekly here in Phoenix called the Phoenix New Times. I can't tell you how many times I skipped lunch, and now I couldn't dare, like I'll hit, 2:00 and I'll be too feeble to continue if I don't, scarf down a banana or something at least.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the thing is, I stopped drinking about 7 years ago, and I even stopped coffee last year, right? So I'm like, it's
Oh, no kidding! Wow,
absolutely.
you're living like a monk over there, Stephen.
Sort of, yeah. But of course, food then becomes your vice, as it were, or your kind of your turn to.
Sure.
So I haven't given up all sort of vices. I have to say that I'll put that in now because I'm going to come across like some sort of Zen monk. Far from it, but sleep, right, has become much more important than it ever used to be. Partly because I got much more interested in dreaming, and a friend of mine runs dream retreats in Greece, and partly through his spending a bit of time with her and talking about it. So, so dreaming and sleep suddenly in the last few years became part of the menu. I don't know how you get on with that.
One of the episodes of Bureau of Lost Culture that I most enjoyed was the great chat that you presented with Alan Moore, one of my all-time favorite authors and thinkers for that matter. And he and Gary Lockman talking a little bit about, dreaming and stuff like that. I think at one point, Alan said something along the lines of he's too thoroughly saturated with hashish to remember his dreams. And I related to that. Cannabis is legal here in the U.S. where I'm from. So I'm on a little extended break from that right now. And it is funny how the dreams come back. I had a dream just the other night that was enough to mess up my whole day,
Right.
And so you sort of, it wasn't a traditional nightmare per se, but it was, playing a show with my band and it going very, very poorly in the dream.
Yeah.
It was, we were not connecting. And then in the dream, somebody from the venue came up and asked me to sign some forms while we were mid-song. And it's such a strange, mundane sort of dream. And I said in the dream, to this person, hey, we're in the middle of a song. And she said, yes, I know, but nobody cares.
Ouch.
And I woke up as if that had really happened. And it lingered with me all day long. So I know that our subconscious, if nothing else, is sometimes tasking us with working things out, right? As we sleep, or highlighting something that needs to be worked out. But, I, of course, love listening to Gary Lockman talk about precognitive dreams and stuff like that. Do you find that you experience that side of it?
A little bit. I mean, and for anybody who doesn't know, Gary Lockman was Gary Valentine, the bass player of Blondie, and he's American, lives in London now and has done for many years. And as I say, he put down the plectrum, picked up the pen, gave up rock and roll, took up writing, and he's become the UK's foremost writer on the esoteric, and he's written a book on precognitive dreaming, and I think one of the early Blondie songs, Touched by Your Presence, I think it is about that. So he's been a long-term precognitive dreaming, which is just dreaming about the future. And as he says, I think he says it in that interview, doesn't he, that it's not useful dreaming.
No, not typically. It's the mundanity that I sort of talked about, just sort of normal things, but they're a little ahead of time. And I am very attracted to that idea that perhaps in the state of sleep, our consciousness maybe connects to whatever that is, non-linear experience of time.
I think that's really important about it. And I mean, the other thing is lucid dreaming, and I did an interview with Sarah Janes, who's my friend, who's the lucid dreaming teacher, which is basically when you become conscious in the dream, that you remember that you're dreaming, and then you can, to an extent, sort of take control and direct the dream. That's very interesting. But I think that, you mentioned that your painful dream from the other night, and sometimes one has these dreams and you wake up and it's like you're physically kind of affected by it. It's almost like it's in your body, and it can really leak into your day, can't it? It could be some experience like that, or some devastating romantic loss, disconnected with your actual life. So who knows what's going on, really? This is just a theory of mine. It's not based on anything, but I write notes on what I've dreamt the night before. I never analyse them. It's just a case of writing them down, and that, of course, makes you remember them more. And I've got this theory that it just kind of moistens your imagination in some way, because the dream world, the unconscious itself, is so odd, and it's so odd in a sort of David Lynch way. It puts together all these strange things, and like you said, you're on stage and somebody interrupts your song, says you've got to fill in this form, and it's like, whoa, what is going on there? And in the dream, of course, you don't say, hold on a minute, that's not right, because you don't realise that you're dreaming. So all this stuff I find is just sort of grist for the mill, and it's just a way of being conscious of something that's going on which you're not really in control of, but it can feed in somehow into your creative life. I hope so. That's what I trust, yeah.
David Lynch is one of my favorite artists, and certainly one of the biggest inspirations for me in terms of my own creativity. And his rather odd autobiography, Room to Dream, which was written with Christine McKenna, who's another big influence of mine. I'm a big fan of her interviews. It was written in this way where, she writes a chapter about him, and then the next chapter is him sort of responding to it and just talking about what he remembers. And there's that great clip of him working on the third season of Twin Peaks, The Return, where he's kind of lamenting that the schedule is stopping them from getting to, I think he uses the term, go dreamy. Like, I could have spent a week shooting this scene, because he wants to be in that place. And I do think that when you talk about grist for the mill, sleep is this sort of naturally psychedelic thing that we do. Sleep and dreams have this quality of really seeming to tap into the mystery. But as I have attempted, a meditation practice, I find that it's not the exact same thing, but you do end up bumping into those strange, inexplicable things that are kind of lurking in your own head, really deep down there,
And possibly outside your own head. That's the other possibility, that you're
100%.
Yeah, you're connecting with the collective unconscious as well. Again, can we prove this? No. But there's often something going on. You think, well, that's not connected with my life in any kind of obvious way, and biographically speaking, or what's going on. So where's it coming from? And, some of the images that you get in dreams as well. It's like, where's that from?
Maybe in this state of, extreme relaxation that is sleep, your lens is connected to the other lenses out there, right? And you're sort of experiencing the world in this more connected way. You hear it over and over again, people saying, it seemed as if this was coming from someplace completely outside of me. Right. These lyrics, or this vision, this scene, whatever it is, it was coming from outside of me. And people are really quick, I think, to want to rationalize it and go, well, it just must be something deep in your unconscious or your subconscious that you just weren't aware of, and it's nothing woo-woo or nothing, magical or whatever. But I don't find that is all that satisfactory of a way of thinking about it. So I tend to think that there is something that happens in the creative process, in the act of creation, where maybe you do tap into the broader, more collective thing. Right.
Well, Paul McCartney says that yesterday appeared to him completely formed in a dream, doesn't he? There's so many things that people have dreamt them. I think the DNA molecule, was it, or the benzene ring? I think Alan talks about that. Not just poets and songwriters and artists, but scientists too. Inventions have come to people. Now, are they personal? Do they own them? They might end up owning them, in the sense that Paul McCartney It's got the publishing rights to Yesterday.
He's got the
he made a lot of money. Right. He made a lot of money out of it. But was it a product of the collective unconscious, channeled through him? It can only be him, of course. I mean, I'm not disputing his importance in that process, but did that come from something wider? I often wonder about that with art, and particularly in the way it's marketed and sold and possessed and stuff. There is a sense for me that if a song is a hit, it's a hit because somebody made it, somebody wrote it, but it's also a hit because of the culture that it emerged in and the people who listened to it and loved it. You know, a song is, well loved, or it becomes a huge success, not just because of the person who wrote it, it's because of the culture too. And it would affect things like copyright in a way, is that we tend to attribute the creative genius to individuals, but actually part of it is in the culture.
Yeah, I think it's Brian Eno, who sort of talks about his concept of, he's one of my white whales, by the way. I've never got Brian Eno on Transmissions. We're fortunate enough to have his brother, Roger, who is also an incredible creative force and deeply thoughtful individual. So,
did you resist asking Roger if he could connect you with Brian?
I did.
Good.
I asked a few questions about Brian, and got some stuff about their collaboration. But yeah, I did resist that because it's something about that felt icky to me. I've resisted things like that in the past, and have always wondered if that's what separates me from a real go-getter reporter, you know what I mean, who was able to push through that feeling of ickiness to just say, hey, could you connect me with so-and-so? But Eno talks about the concept of scenius, I think is what he calls it. The genius of a scene, of a culture that's creating something beyond the individual. And we're in this very strange moment where, something like AI is fascinating to me, and all of the issues and all of the slop of AI is gross, but it nonetheless raises some very interesting questions for me. When people say that this tool, it can't create without all of the input of the internet itself, right? It has to draw on all of that. I've seen, great smart people refer to it as something like a plagiarism machine. And yet I am a little hesitant when we get into this territory, because I don't believe that really anything comes from just one person. When I write a song, whether I know I'm doing it or not, I am drawing on every song I've heard, or everything similar to it. I'm pulling in a lot of inputs that aren't just me. We create the song as we're hearing it, just as much as the artist creates it.
Yes.
And that's a true thing. So I just think that notion of individualized authorship, it comes into question for me. I think these are fascinating things. I don't think it's a problem to be solved or a riddle to be answered necessarily. But I do think that notion of is anybody just creating solely from their individualized experience, or do we have to take in our culture in a broader sense? The great example of this is the Light in the Attic reissue of Rodriguez's album Cold Fact, an album that basically did nothing upon release but became, decades later, this huge thing. And so does the creative process work on a different timetable than us, right? Was the culture not ready for it then? Was something crowding it out, but then later people connect to it? I don't know. That starts to feel mystical and magical to me. And for a long time, I resisted the notion of mysticism and magic. And now I can't get around it. I just don't think there's really anything else worth focusing on to a certain degree.
Of course, we want artists, creative people to get paid. So we've got a system of copyright which in this country is quite good in a way, because it means that works go into the public domain after a certain amount of time. And that feels right to me, because it reflects both. It reflects the rights and the needs of the creator to get rewarded for their work, for their individual contribution to the culture. But it also recognises that those creative products are created to an extent by the culture. So I think that's the right balance when we think about it in terms of, is there a right time for things? I found that even with songs, right? I mean, I've got one more album to do, and there's going to be a song on it which I wrote years ago, but I couldn't finish it until recently. And I was thinking it had its own timeline. you saw it Rodriguez album. How many albums have been like that where they've come out and disappeared, and then years later we've realised this is a work of genius, Was it always a work of genius, or is it that the culture's changed? When it comes to AI, you're quite right to bring that up. I had an interesting experience recently that I went to see an installation in London at a pop-up gallery, and it's a film by an artist called Matt Collishaw. He's been around for quite a long time, but he's been experimenting with AI. And it was quite a revelation for me. It's a sort of 15-minute film. He trained the AI on specific things to create the film. But what blew me away was that, as you say, there's a lot of slop out there. There's a lot of AI doing cheesy stuff or imitations of what we already do or slightly better versions of what we could do. This was something completely different, right? He'd done something with this film, or him with the AI done something with this film which we couldn't do. It was beyond us.
Yeah.
And that was terrific. But the other thing which was slightly worrying, I have to say, was that this film was deeply moving. And I've been to a few AI things recently, AI in film, and which I'm interested in. People say on the panel, they'll say, well, we don't have to worry because, you can never replace the human in this equation. So don't panic about what AI is going to do. But actually, this AI film, it was very moving. And suddenly that felt like, we've sort of gone into potentially different world here. I think if artists can use it and collaborate with it and produce things which we could never conceive of before, whether it be film, music, or whatever, great. But if it's going to churn out more boring content, or just eat loads of people's jobs,
Absolutely. And I don't want to be in any way like Pollyanna-ish about it or try to skirt around the obvious implications for people who need to get paid and need to eat, and these things coming in and just like taking their means away to do that. I don't find myself particularly drawn to these technologies in part because of the implications and who owns them and who benefits from everybody becoming addicted to them. Similarly to the way we see social media, these incredible technologies that have such vast potential, but end up kind of getting used for maybe what we would call, less than ideal uses. They're not facilitating the deep communication that they could. They're in fact making us more disconnected. But I do have a lot of faith in the human ability to break a technology and to use it in a way that it is not intended to be used to create something completely new. The danger of something like AI is just everybody just saying, well, I don't need to look at anybody else's art. I can just ask AI to make me what if Star Wars took place in the 1950s, really silly and kind of like a not very creative sort of uses. But I do think that as we see people start to do really strange things with them and use these technologies in really innovative or novel ways, maybe that'll be interesting. But I also think about when you see a piece of work that really moves you and you realize, I don't think a human could have done this on their own. That's a strange sensation.
It is. And I think that's it. If we can break it, as you say, or twist it in a way that produces things which are both completely new and also emotional. People had the same worries about sampling, for instance, when hip hop really got going and lots of people were resisting that. Oh, well, you're just, stealing a piece of other people's music. But of course, what hip hop artists were doing when they did that, making something new with it and making something that's still communicated, was still creative, possibly more so in a way that couldn't previously been imagined. You couldn't really imagine hip hop in the 60s. You wouldn't get your head around it. But look what's happened. So I feel quite optimistic about it, and I think that there's always going to be a place for both. I don't know if this is something that you've seen. There's been a very successful TV show here recently. It's called Adolescence, and I think it's gone to the States. It's on Netflix. It's very, very British, and each episode is one take. It's an extraordinary technical feat. Still don't really understand that they've done it, and it's about this kid, an adolescent kid. It's very dark, by the way, and realistic. That couldn't be done by AI, and there would be no point doing it by AI. So these things can sit alongside each other. We can still do extraordinary things which don't need AI.
I'm a big fan of singers who don't sound, let's say, traditionally good. You know what I mean? Or who are not like the most technically capable artists in that field. Is an off-key note, is a slightly sour pitch, is that going to start to signify something new to people in a way? You know, I kind of hope it does in a certain way. I kind of like that idea when perfection, quote unquote, perfection is possible. Perhaps imperfection becomes that much more engaging and that much more human. The question with like technology and AI is, you know, is it going to replace us or is it going to become conscious? And it's like, well, we don't have a good definition for what consciousness is. Is AI going to solve that mystery, you know? Is it going to teach us more about what it means to be human? I have no idea. We're living in this time where so many of the old stories are starting to break down and not carry the same resonance and not feel, you know, real to people. So perhaps we're in this time where, you know, we have to figure out what being human actually means. You know, talking with different artists, most everybody I've talked to has expressed some version of the skepticism that we've both expressed here. Yeah. You know, I think that's why I've done the show more than anything else, is because there is a mystery at the heart of it all. I don't want to solve the mystery. I want to explore the mystery. I want to wander around in the mystery. I want to remain curious about what could happen, because I think we get into a lot of trouble when we can't imagine things turning out some unexpected way.
Yeah, well, to your point about consciousness, that came up too in the conversation with Alan Moore. And folks, most people will know Alan Moore through the films that were made of his graphic novels, Watchmen, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, From Hell,
V for Vendetta.
Yeah. Alan is a practicing magician, not as in a conjurer, he doesn't do card tricks, but in his own way, he talks about that in an interview, and it's a very appealing way to see magic and mystery in the world. But he talks about that is that we don't know what consciousness is. We keep talking about it, and is AI going to get conscious? But science hasn't really made any progress with that. You know, it is the big mystery. And one thing I'm pretty sure when I realised that in that event is that AI can't replace that. It can't replace people in a room, and it can't replace conversations and the exploration, the stories that people have got to tell about the culture. For me, one of my questions is, what is counterculture? Or should I say, where is counterculture? Mm-hmm. You're not going to solve that question. It's not like you're going to get it all down on a piece of A4 paper or be able to put it in a blog post. It's impossible to define it. Its roots are very deep, it's very far-reaching, it's, you know, pan-global. It is a mystery, you know, and that's the thing. It's exploring the mystery, trying to push back the frontier a bit into what's effectively an infinite landscape. Particularly intrigued by the notion of that young people in the 60s and 70s, maybe late 50s, in America, in the UK, in Europe, genuinely thought that they could change the world. I mean, really change the world. And I'm very intrigued by that notion, and I love stories that bring it up. And of course, they did a little bit, but they didn't really. And some of my guests have talked about how they felt that they failed, you know, in some ways. But that spirit, to try and evoke that spirit, that's what I'm curious about, you know, in these conversations. And just to ask you, really, you've had some amazing guests, and even recently, Jeff Bridges, the dude. That interview is so funny. He's just comes across as being so sweet, actually. You know, unpretentious, what you'd expect and what you'd hope for in Jeff Bridges. You know, very successful actor, but also musician, and done all these things. And, you know, from my point of view, a proper countercultural figure. You've done all sorts of others too. I mean, let me ask you, Jason, it's impossible, but I'm going to do it anyway. You know, of all those conversations, are there any that really stick out to you that, you know, you're really proud of? Or if you were doing you had to do a compilation of, you know, a top 10, you know, who are you going to put in? I'm not going to hold you to it, but who would you put in there?
Well, just like if you were to ask me, you know, what my favorite album is or what my favorite song is, you'd get different answers depending on different days, you know. This most recent season of Transmissions is our 10th season. Justin did these sort of sound collages that were originally shared through that podcast feed. But in 2016, I found myself very, very interested in doing an interview show and was listening to other podcasts and wanted to kind of go down that road. And because I was already doing a lot of interviews for him in addition to playlists and reviews and things like that. I said, do you think it'd be cool if we sort of started up like an interview show? He was game. So over the last, 9 years going into our 10th, I've had so many talks that have been mind-blowing and have really moved me. But there are, of course, some really important ones. And quite a few of them have been in our most recent season. With this 10th season, I've started to find myself questioning, okay, what is this podcast for? I had to kind of get more serious about it. And so the Jeff Bridges one is an absolute favorite, undoubtedly. Just hearing Jeff's voice was incredible to me, and he was so funny and he was so thoughtful. I think Jeff Bridges still does believe that we can change the world, We talked about his work trying to end, world hunger. In that sort of Buckminster Fuller-esque way, we have the ability to end hunger right now. You know what I mean? It's not that we can't. It's that we don't. And so that was an episode for me that really, really moved me. I really loved when I had Jim Jarmusch on.
Just about to say that, Jim Jarmusch. I mean, he would definitely on my list.
In both of those cases, I had interviewed them before, by phone. I think that was my second time talking with Jim. But previously, he had been with his collaborator in the band Squirrel, Carter Logan. And we were talking about the Patterson soundtrack. But when he came on the podcast, I don't get nervous about many of them anymore. I'm sure it's sort of similar for you. You can't because you've done so many. But I was very nervous to talk with Jim because, well, I don't know. I didn't want to seem uncool. I didn't want to sound dumb to Jim Jarmusch, I don't know. We were like 3 minutes in, and I was like, oh my God, this guy is so chill. He is so game to talk. He is so excited to actually do this. I'm not bothering him or whatever. And that was like an incredible feeling. So that one definitely comes to mind in terms of just getting a chance to talk with somebody whose art has influenced and made such an impact on my life. And then there are ones that are like names that aren't quite as big. One that comes to mind to me right now is Dorothy Moskowitz from the United States of America, the 60s psych band. She's continued making music. And, that was a really, really cool one. And I really, really felt like I was getting the chance to talk with somebody whose creative work is still ahead of its time. Yeah. There aren't a lot of interviews with her out there, And so that feeling of I'm helping somebody whose story should be better known, I'm helping to expose that story. I also have ones that are favorites for different reasons. Like my interview with Jay Mascis from Dinosaur Jr., which I think is the most brutal and most difficult one that I have ever done. Jay does not seem to be a fan of being interviewed. I listened back to it, and I'm just on the very edge, right, of being able to to do anything in it. Yeah. I kind of enjoy hearing it. I hear myself stretching in ways that I did not think I would be able to, In that interview, at one point, his dog was at his feet, and I start to hear the dog snoring because Jay's responses are so scant, and he's not giving me much at all. And I was like, Jay, is there a dog in there with you? And he was like, yeah. We start talking about his dog snoring. For a podcast, leaving that in is almost perverse, right? Because nobody sees the dog and they don't know what we're talking about. And so I like the ones that have pushed me way, way, way out of my comfort zone as well. So many other heroes. Nick Lowe. Just talking with Nick Lowe is fun. And he's somebody whose music has meant so, so much to me. Or this season we had Steve Lillywhite on, and of course I knew that Steve Lillywhite is one of the, kind of most successful producers, really, of the last 30, 40 years or whatever. But digging into the preparation for that, I didn't even realize the impact that his productions had on me, all the way to really some of the first songs I remember hearing.
Have you had any very either emotional or quite difficult moments.
There have been over the years, some really intense stuff. Tamara Lindemann from the Weather Station, she's been on a few times, and we always end up talking about the apocalypse, the sort of dire conditions environmentally. William Tyler, he is an open book in this way that is really, really powerful for me, and he's one of the people who I feel like we became friends through doing the podcast. I talked with him a few times. So we got to the point where on his most recent episode, he was really willing to talk to me about sobriety and talk about some of his struggles in that regard. And that's hard. Death comes up, some really intense stuff. There have been really emotional moments. I find myself just so thankful for these artists who are willing to explore territory like that. There's such a pressure on people in general, but specifically artists, right, to present a sort of idealized version of themselves these days. Yeah. And so when that cracks and you get a glimpse at the real person, I'm just always so thankful for that. I've learned as an interviewer that sometimes that means I have to do a little of that myself, right? You have to kind of give a little bit in order to allow a person to feel safe enough to do that. I try not to do the thing where I make the show just about me, but you do have to put enough of yourself in there that they feel like it's a two-way exchange. And
yes, I mean, it's the balance of it not being about us, which I definitely don't want. I don't like that in other podcasts when, it becomes about the host. But of course, to get behind the curtain, particularly with people who've been interviewed a lot, that's the interesting but difficult thing. I've had actually a couple of interviews that I've done. I've not actually broadcast. One of them was with Eric von Daniken, who was the guy who made an absolute mint in the late 60s and 70s. He wrote a series of books called Was God an Astronaut? In the Chariots of the Gods, that guy, right?
I didn't know you interviewed him.
I interviewed him, but I've not actually put it out yet. And one of the reasons is that I really enjoyed it. He's a sweetie, but he's so polished. I could not get behind the polish. And for me, the point is not hero worship in any way, but to try and get to the person. So, for instance, when I have interviewed, some fairly famous musicians, Johnny Marr, for instance, as from the Smiths.
Great episode. Such a good episode. I had no idea that he was as countercultural as, of course, he is.
Right, exactly. And, of course, apart from the Smiths, he's done all sorts of stuff. Loads of soundtracks and albums and collaborations. He's been a very successful musician. But the thing is that, for me, that wasn't the interesting thing. And I certainly wasn't going to ask him about the Smiths, because he's talked about it a lot, and he and Morrissey don't get on, and it was the 4 years, I think, that was it in his life. I was much more interested in how Johnny Marr became Johnny Marr, or how Barry Adamson became Barry Adamson. For sure I could ask him about being in the same band as Nick Cave, and everybody's interested in that too. But it's much more interesting to find out, for me anyway, about how they became who they were and where they became it. Johnny in Manchester, what was Manchester like in the late 60s and 70s? With Eric von Daniken, who lives in a sort of Swiss mansion, I just could not get behind the front. He was entertaining. So I've never put it out, because for me it's like, well, it feels a bit like a PR exercise.
Oh yeah, I absolutely know what you mean. Sometimes I'll have somebody on the show and they're on, 4 or 5 other podcasts, and I think it's very natural for these people who have to do interviews. You settle into your pitch, right? You settle into your stories. You settle into your, here's what I'm saying about this album. And so I've heard, at times, interviews with artists where even if the questions sort of differ, the answers sound so much like what they said on my show, and I don't like that, not just for sort of egoic purposes or whatever, but if you want to dig deeper, I want to dig deeper. I want to find something. I want to try to get the interview out of somebody that nobody else is going to, as best I can, That's become more and more important to me. I really like trying to get people off of press cycle, if at all possible, because you end up getting a much fresher, open situation than when somebody's been giving interviews for the last 6 hours, and now they have to talk with you. For me, leaning into my own interests, leaning into my own esoteric, notions or whatever, with an artist, hopefully that gives them the sort of bandwidth to go, okay, this is not the standard interview. When I interviewed the great guitarist Bill Frisell, who I'm just a massive fan of, he's done interviews and I've read a lot of interviews with him, and Bill has this beatific Zen-like quality. And I remember I started that interview by just asking him, Bill, you seem so genteel and calm and poised. What does Bill Frisell look like when he's really pissed off? And I remember the laugh that came out of his mouth and then the subsequent answer. I realized right from that moment, we had already gotten somewhere. You know what I mean? Because nobody's asking him that. That to me was a feeling of like, this is what I want to do with this show. And I've been so fortunate.
You mentioned Brian Eno, who's also on my list of people I'd love to interview. I have been in contact with him, sort of. He's just very busy all the time. He's brilliant, and he's brilliant in conversation. He's not going to talk about U2. He doesn't like talking about the past, basically. He wants to talk about the future. But that's the point of it in a way, isn't it? Is to try and maybe surprise the guests. So it's maybe more interesting for them too.
Oh,
It takes a little bit of time. I interviewed Mike Scott of the Waterboys. He's got an album out. It's a concept album about Dennis Hopper. Since then, he's done quite a few podcasts which really focus on the album. He's on a PR tour, but of course he's got an album to promote. And nothing wrong with that. But the interesting thing in that situation was that he spent time living here in Findhorn, where I am part of the time. The reason being that Findhorn, which is a Scottish village, is next to the Findhorn Foundation, which is the UK's oldest alternative community. It's a bit like Esalen, in California. It's this early countercultural hippie commune. It's still here. And Mike, during the Waterboys era, sort of disappeared for a while, and he lived here for a bit. I met him last year because he played a benefit gig. We got talking about that, and there is a moment actually in the interview, which I think probably is one of my favourite moments in all the shows I've done, which is that he's talking about the profound effect that being here had on him, and he breaks down in tears. And in the studio, we were in the studio together in London, and it was a very intense moment for both of us, I'm sure, because we don't know each other. It's not like we're buddies or anything, and he knew it was being recorded, and I left it in there, not all of it, because there was a long gap, obviously, when he was a bit overwhelmed. We got there, wherever there is, in some sense, we summoned up the spirit of his countercultural life. And then the conversation was about that, not just about the fact he's got an album to promote. And I've had a few moments like that down the years, where some bit of magic has happened.
I listened to that interview, and I like the Waterboys a lot. It wasn't just a moment for you two. It was a moment for a lot of us, I think. I know, listening to that, hearing him, he's talking about, he's sort of his heart opening in this way.
Yeah.
And I felt a tear roll down my face. There are a lot of podcasts, and there are endless things jockeying for our attention at any given moment now. Maybe more so than ever before, in terms of human history. To hear something like that, it still has the ability to be very profound. Even reminded me, this is why you do this, for moments like this. And it's a difficult thing to get there, and you got to be in the right place and time for it to happen. But when it happens, it really does shine a light on the human experience. And it's a moment that made us all feel more human, more in touch with our heart. That interview, it went so far beyond the hyping the latest record. I like to think that those moments are possible for listeners, and try to always hold that idea in my head, that maybe you're helping to facilitate a conversation that is going to articulate something for somebody out there.
That's why we're doing it, isn't it? Obviously to communicate with the person that you're interviewing, because often they're very fascinating people and they've done fascinating things, but it's really to connect with a community of people out there. And as you say, when moments like that, they do have the potential to break through. I'm sort of a fan of the Waterboys. I'm not a huge fan, but I like them. But I became a big fan of him after that because he had the balls to be vulnerable in that situation. And it's not he's not crying in his beer sort of sentimentality stuff. This is a case of remembering being genuinely moved by something and allowing that to be in the room. And I was like, you're a great musician and cool and all that stuff. And it looks cool. It looks rock and roll cool, but I thought, that took some courage to do that. Could any of us be vulnerable in that way, Tom Robinson, who, I don't know, I'm not sure if American listeners will know much about Tom. Tom is a musician. He had some big hits here and in Europe. His biggest hit is Glad to Be Gay, and it became an anthem, obviously, for the gay movement over here. But they're two of my favourite episodes. Not really because of Tom's status as a musician, but he was telling the story of how he came out as a young man in the counterculture, so he's in the sort of mid-60s through to mid-70s, and so what was it like being gay, young man, and, he nearly committed suicide when he was young because of confusion over his sexuality. And again, it was one of those moments when he was talking about it, and obviously it was very present with him still. It gave me an insight into a completely different sort of experience than my own. Fascinating because of the times, for sure. London in the early 70s and the whole gay liberation front and all that, the political stuff. But it's like somebody else's experience, which you don't have yourself, to hear the story, but also to witness the story, because as the story was being told by the storyteller, we were all living it.
Yeah. Empathy, storytelling, connecting, hearing about lives that are different from ours. It all has this capacity. It all has this potential to change the way we think, to change the way we see other people, to change the way we see the world. And those moments that it breaks through, they're really special. And I definitely hold those dear, and know full well that there's a good chance that some people have those listening to the show that I do. It's a great comfort, and it's a great motivator to continue to build this archive.
It is. Well, listen, I'm going to ask you, Jason, so in terms of going forward, and you mentioned earlier, Brian, two things. First of all, who's on your list, FBI's most wanted list for Jason? But also, what have you got any plans, aspirations for the future for Aquarium Drunkard and for Transmissions?
Well, yeah. So I guess in terms of Eno was on the list. The late David Lynch was certainly on my list, and I tried a handful of times. I practiced transcendental meditation, so I even thought to myself, should I try to go up the flagpole? And then I got into that feeling of ickiness, and I thought to myself, no. It'll happen when if it happens. And it didn't, but it's okay. Other people who are sort of on the dream list. Emmylou Harris is somebody who comes to mind. Van Morrison. I really want to talk with Van Morrison.
That would be interesting. Grumpy Van. I've been in contact with his publicist because he's got another album coming out. So he's on the list. Somebody who I actually did speak with or for a different Radio Free Aquarium Drunkard piece, but I really want to get Eric Davis on the podcast proper. I'm a deep, deep, deep fan of him, and he's really changed the way I think about things. Alan Moore, I could talk with Alan Moore about more music-focused stuff for sure. So he's on the list. And as far as plans here in Phoenix, I get my version of seasonal depression is when the summer really hits. And so I thought, maybe take the summer off. I guess I can probably just say it here. I don't know if I've said it publicly anywhere, but I will now. We're going to launch a mini-series, maybe sort of more like a maxi series that will be recurring, in which Tyler Wilcox, who's another great contributor to Aquarium Drunkard, will be speaking with one artist each episode about one specific Neil Young song. So it's going to be called All One Song. And I am not the host, I'm the producer on it. People will still get a weekly podcast from Aquarium Drunkard, even when I stop doing this one for the summer. And then, we'll return with more transmissions later in the fall. I think that there might be a potential book in some of the interviews. That's the one, I guess, drawback about podcasts in some sense, is that they tend to feel a little bit more ephemeral than I wish they did. And so
that's one reason why the archive is important to me, because I know that years after I do an interview, there are still people discovering it, and that's a good feeling. But the idea of a book is like, wow, that would be something real solid that you could hold in your hand, you know? Those are the sort of immediate plans, in addition to all the other stuff I'm working on with Wastoids and my own music and things like that.
That's plenty.
It is plenty. It's probably too much. As I'm hearing the words come out of my mouth about this book, it's like, well, shit, now I'm going to have to really do it. Somebody's going to point it out, you know, hey, you mentioned a book, where is it? So maybe I can make it really happen.
You have to do it now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I look forward to whatever you're working on next.
Probably about half of the shows are not actually interviews with people about themselves. They're actually interviews with people about a subject. I mean, I've got one coming up on electronic voice phenomena, for instance. So
cool.
You know, the main protagonist in that are long dead, so it's somebody who's a practitioner but is talking about it. But so there's plenty of subjects that I really want to cover. But if it was guests in the music world, it would, without any doubt, have to be Tom Waits.
Oh yeah, he would be incredible to speak.
What I'd really like to do is to do Tom Waits and Kathleen Brennan at the same time, because, you know, this husband and wife team, and I think Kathleen, interestingly, is not recognised enough for her contribution to Tom's work, because she writes lyrics quite often, and some of my very, very favourite songs, I think You Can Never Hold Back Spring and Alice, the lyrics were written by Kathleen, you know. And I thought it would just be great as a sort of, you know, to get them in the room together. This is one which is, and it's going to sound so obvious that I'm a bit resistant to say it, and it is possible, and that's McCartney. The thing with McCartney will be to try to get behind the curtain. And the thing I'm particularly interested in with Paul McCartney is the way that he supported the counterculture in London in the 60s. So I wouldn't be talking about John Lennon. I wouldn't even be talking about the Beatles. I mean, obviously that's in the background, but it was much more. He was deeply supportive of the counterculture. He funded a lot of stuff and was really into that. And he obviously got massively affected by it. As you know, coming to London and with the counterculture going on, really, of course, had a transformative effect on the Beatles. And it was a feedback loop. You know, they were so important in that. So he'd definitely be up there. But I think for the future, I'm interested in your idea of doing seasons and taking a break. I think I need to do that for lots of reasons. What I'd really like to do is to expand it community-wise and do more events, more live events. I do curate a lot of live events anyway, and I'd like to do more Bureau of Lost Culture events. And those live events, of course, could be online as well. They could be, you know, Zoom meetups. And as you mentioned, I curate festival called London Month of the Dead every October, and it's been on for 12 years, you know, so that's always going on. I've written 2 books myself, and I love, you know, giving talks and being parts of stuff live. I think it's, you know, particularly when you're in the studio a lot, whether as a musician or as a broadcaster, it can get a bit sort of stir crazy, right? And it's good to get out in the world and
shake off some of the loneliness that is just a byproduct of it.
Totally,
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I think that would be the plan for the Bureau of Lost Culture in future. Do less better, but also do more when the resources allow you to do more. So I think that's it. Maybe increase the resources. I've got to turn those dribbles into streams, or, you know, into a gushing fountain. Yeah.
If there are any eccentric billionaires out there who are really looking to get into the podcast game, I've got some folks to introduce you to.
Yeah, exactly. If you want to sponsor a noble countercultural endeavours, crazy endeavours, we'd love to hear from you. Yeah, so there we go. So listen, Jason, I just wanted to say it's great to talk to you. Really appreciate Aquarium Drunkard. I mean, the whole project, but also in the transmissions, and it's great listening. Lots of moving, fascinating stuff. Not just musicians and cultural figures as well. So keep it up. Great to talk to you today.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do the same. It's your work is a real inspiration, and I just, you know, I would be remiss if I didn't say it. You know, Aquarium Drunkard turns 20 this year. 20 years in internet time is a long time. I'm very appreciative of Justin offering that platform up and creating a thing that is, I think, countercultural in its own way.
All the articles, all the mixes, and the radio transmissions, it's a huge amount of work. It's a huge amount of love poured into the culture. You know, it's a testament to the power of pop culture, youth culture, counterculture to, you know, transform us even a little bit for the better.
Stephen, I really, really appreciate you taking the time. This is certainly one of the most fun podcast that I have ever taped, so I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much to Jason, and of course to Justin Gage, who birthed and is the guiding light behind Aquarium Drunkard. Long may they continue to guide us through the extraordinary labyrinthine worlds of alternative music. If you haven't already and want to dive in, a great start, I think, is Jason's recent interview with the dude himself, Jeff Bridges. Just fabulous. I did do a lot more talking in this episode, which I'm not usually keen to do, but it was good to be able to express a bit more of what Bureau Lost Culture is about. As I record this, we are over 130 episodes in. That went fast. If you're interested, the most listened to episodes are Alan Moore on Magic, The Myth of the Magic Mushroom, Spirit, Soul and Rock and Roll with Mike Skull, we talked a bit about that, Post-Punk Druidry with Youth, How to Expand Your Consciousness, Alan Moore on Counterculture, Alan's very popular, The Divided Self of R.D. Lang, I was surprised by that one, The Lowdown LA Life of Tom Waits, City of the Beast, Alistair Crowley's London. But let me know your favourites. We have a little poll to ask people where they are at and all about them and their interests. If you haven't completed it yet, I will put a link to it in the show notes, along with a connection to Aquarium Drunkard, where we can all keep listening. Thanks for listening. I will see you, hear you, meet you further down the road, round the bend, and over the hillsides for more of these transmissions from the other side.